So let's get started on reading just the first book of Dante's On World Government, or De Monarchia, on monarchy, I suppose. I don't know a lot about this work, except that it was written by the Dante, Dante's Inferno Dante, the poet, supposedly. And it was written in the 14th century, around 1310. Obviously, we're reading it in translation, and obviously, I've given you the whole PDF, so I've uploaded the whole PDF, and then I put up a page just listing the page numbers, the sections and page numbers you should read for each reading, which is simple enough. But the first part of this course is subtitled, or the title of the first part of this course is Ancient, Medieval, and Modern. Aristotle was our ancient author. Dante is our medieval author. Middle Ages, really late Middle Ages, 14th century, and I think is very profitable to read. I mean, to get a sense of how the culture of the Middle Ages imagined social thought, imagined politics, which is like Aristotle. There are things in Aristotle that are really, well, I think it's all interesting. And they're very fruitful ideas, and maybe there are ideas that are not so fruitful. But the purpose of this course is not to give you things to agree with. It's to give you things to help to make you think. That being said, let's take a look at the first part, at least, of this reading, this PDF of On World Government. We're just reading book one. And we see that the title of book one, That Mankind Needs Unity and Peace, which I think gives you a clue to his political thought. And the trick is to sort of see why unity and peace is so important to Dante. But let's just look at section one here. The knowledge, it's called The Knowledge of a Single Temporal Government Over Mankind is Most Important and Least Explored. I think the most important thing to note here is his use of the word temporal government. For a medieval thinker like Dante, Christian like Dante, temporal government was to be contrasted with spiritual government or eternal government. And that was really, Dante is thinking of temporal government in terms of human beings governing each other, as opposed to the overall government of the universe. I'm sure that he has a better expression than eternal government or spiritual government. But he's really thinking of the government of God over the universe, which is, of course, for him, much more all-encompassing. That God lays down the law for the whole universe, including human beings. But temporal government is the government of this earthly life. That's why it's called temporal, I think. Of course, for a Christian looking forward to the fate of his eternal soul, Dante sees that God's government is more comprehensive and perhaps more important. But the idea is that for a religious person, specifically for a Christian like Dante, there is the overall picture of the government of the whole universe. And that's an eternal government, and that's God's law, God's providence for the universe. But within that, human beings have to make do in this temporal life while they are human beings, while they're alive in this earthly form before their existence in the afterlife, the temporal government. So temporal power was really a way to characterize, let's say, the power of a king or a president, or the power of the rulers of a republic, as opposed to the, let's say, power for Dante of the Pope in Rome, which was not just a temporal power, but a spiritual power, a different sort of authority. So temporal power is really government, politics. I think what Aristotle would call politics is temporal government. What is Dante getting at just in this first section? Well, I mean, it's just really an introduction, right? I mean, he is saying that he, feels a responsibility here to add to the truths of mankind, very noble, sort of highfalutin thing. And he thinks that he has something to say about temporal government. He says here at the bottom, page 3, among the truths that remain hidden, though useful, the knowledge of the temporal government of the world is most useful and most unknown. And since this knowledge is not directly gainful, it has been neglected by all. I therefore propose to drag it from its hiding place, in order that my alertness may be useful to the world, and may bring me the glory of being the first to win this great prize. What is the great prize? What is the great knowledge? I think, what the purpose of temporal government is, which is basically politics, I would say. And as we'll see, that purpose, the idea is that human politics, like Aristotle, Dante thought that human societies have a purpose, an end or a goal that they are, that they're reaching towards. And then the idea is that, well, okay, if we discover what the goal of politics is, the goal of government is, then we should be able to figure out what the best sort of government is, because it'll be the one that's conducive to that goal. I think that's just what he's saying in that introductory first section. So if we look at section 2, what is he saying there? He says, since this theory is a practical science, that is, practical as well as opposed to theoretical. He's talking about politics, which is practical knowledge, as opposed to the theoretical knowledge that he mentions, things like mathematics and theology. We're talking about human affairs. We're talking about not what we should think is true so much as what we should do because it's right. And so it's a different sort of thing than metaphysics or theology or even physics, science, or mathematics. It's a practical thing. He says, since this theory is a practical science, its first principle is the goal of human civilization, which must be one and the same for all particular civilizations. Maybe that's the most controversial idea that he is proposed so far. First of all, that human civilization has a goal. It has a purpose. There is something that it's for. And secondly, that goal is universal. As he says, that goal must be one and the same for all particular civilizations. That might be something that, as modern people, we would be very hesitant to accept. But for Dante, it kind of follows from his kind of Aristotelian principles, because, of course, he's already mentioned Aristotle and is very much following an Aristotelian way of thought. And that is that the best form of human government follows from human nature. And if human nature is one, that is, if there is a universal nature that human beings have, then what they need to do to live a happy life and what sort of government they need to enable that happy life will be one thing too. Now, that's a certain argument that we can attack if we wish, but it's something that, he's laying out there, and it's a plausible position. It's a credible position. It may not be true. So what is he getting at here? First of all, in this introductory paragraph, he's letting us know what the whole work will be doing. We'll only be reading book 1. So when he says that there are 3 chief questions to be examined, it's only the first one that we'll be concerned with. And that is, he says, we must ask and inquire whether such a government is necessary for the good of the world. And that is really what he's concerned with here. Whether a universal government, this idea of world government, is necessary for the good of the world. How would you determine something like that? Well, he then goes on to talk in section 2 about principles. And that's a word that you should feel, just like, knowing what he means by temporal government, you should understand what he means by a principle. Principle is literally a first thing. A first principle would be the full way of saying it, though it's kind of redundant. But we do say that in English. A first principle. A first principle would be the starting point. Something which is not something that we try to prove, but something which is self-evidently true and is the starting point for proving other things, as he says. He says there in the second paragraph, since any truth which is not itself a principle is demonstrated as following from the truth of some principle. So he's talking about deductive reasoning, where you start with certain self-evident first principles, and then we deduce other truths from those first principles. If you have studied mathematics, especially geometry, in the classical way, Euclidean geometry. He starts with first principles of different sorts, definitions, axioms, postulates, and then Euclid derives his theorems from those first principles. So really what Dante is looking for is the first principle of human government, first principle of politics. And everything, as he says, will follow from that first principle, right? What we decide the first principle of government is, then all of our institutions will be determined by that first principle. So basically, the actions that we take will be determined by the principles that we accept, which basically means the goals that we have. Like whatever we think the goal of human civilization is, that will determine what we do and how we do it. It's like when he talks at the end, he gives the analogy of cutting wood. He says, for example, the way to cut wood for building a house is different from the way to cut wood for a ship. Because if the house is our end goal, then we'll cut wood in a certain way. If a ship is our end goal, then we'll cut in another way. If we determine that the first principle, the basic reason and purpose for human civilization is one thing, then we'll pursue certain types of institutions, certain type of government. If we decide it's something else, we'll pursue other sorts. So the question is, what is that first principle? What is the goal of human civilization? And that is what he gets into in the next section, section 3. So I would say that it is here in section 3 that we get the big idea. Maybe the big idea is that human civilization as a whole has a purpose, something it's aiming towards. Maybe that's the big idea, but here he gives the answer to what that purpose is. And it's extremely interesting. And it follows, I would say, from Aristotelian premises. And that is the idea that everything that exists has a function. So he says a function or a purpose, you might say. And it's holistic and it's hierarchical. You see what he says, the thumb has a purpose, but so does the hand, and so does the arm, and so does the whole human being. So the thumb may have a purpose, but it's subordinate to the purpose of the hand. The hand may have a purpose, but it's subordinate to the purpose of the arm. The arm may have a purpose, but it's subordinate to the purpose of the human individual. And then the human individual is subordinate to the purpose of the community. And so the question is, what is that purpose, right? If everything has a purpose, what is the purpose of human civilization? What is human civilization for? Well, he bases that on human nature. When we talk about human civilization, we're talking about the purpose of, when we talk about the purpose of human civilization, we're talking about the purpose of human beings. And here on page 6, he gives you a very interesting idea. You're like, what is the proper function or the proper end or function or purpose of a human being? And he says, well, what is it that uniquely characterizes human beings? And he says it here in the middle of page 4. He says, it is to be sensitive to intellectual growth, for this trait is not found in beings either above or below man. That is, what is characteristic of human beings? Knowledge, the gaining of knowledge, what he calls intellectual growth. It's what is unique to human beings. We share a lot of, and this is all from Aristotle, we share a lot of our nature with other things, other living things, other animals, but the one unique characteristic that human beings have is reason, the capacity to gain truth. So, as he says here a little bit lower, he says, therefore, it is clear that man's basic capacity is to have a potentiality or power for being intellectual. And since this power cannot be completely actualized in a single man or in any of the particular communities of men above mentioned, there must be a multitude in mankind through whom this whole power can be actualized. He's talking about the growth of knowledge. Like you or I could discover some truth. You or I could advance human knowledge in some particular way. But knowledge as a whole and he's thinking of science, what we would call science. There was no natural science for the medievals was a little different, but he's talking about science, philosophy, theology, ethics, all the different realms. However problematic it may be to say that some of these are realms of knowledge and they're all the same, but he's thinking of it that way. That the purpose of a human being is to gain intellectual growth, but the purpose of human beings as a whole is to move knowledge forward. And we can think of this. I mean, physics has its heroes, right? Newton, Einstein, Heisenberg, Oppenheimer, Hawking. But each of them are individuals who move things forward. They're just the biggest names. Physics as a whole is an undertaking of human beings, of the human species as a whole. Other forms of knowledge, we may say more problematically, knowledge of justice, knowledge of politics, knowledge of ethics. It's harder to trace progress, obviously, in those things than in physics. But he would also say that's each one of us, like Aristotle, the people we're reading, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, Du Bois, Simmons, all of these people we may say individually moved things forward, but it's the human species as a whole that's moving our political understanding, our understanding of ourselves forward. So basically, what is he saying in section 3? There is a purpose to human civilization, and it follows from the purpose of human nature, and that is the growth of knowledge, what he calls intellectual growth. So if that's the purpose, then as we can see just by looking at the subtitle for section 4, the best means towards this end is universal peace. Then we ask ourselves, well, if the purpose of human civilization is, as Dante says, the growth of human knowledge and understanding, what form of government do we need? What do we need to reach that goal and to fulfill that purpose? So Dante has, to his own satisfaction, determined what the first principle is of human civilization, which is similar to saying what is the end or purpose or goal of civilization. It's the growth of knowledge. So then the question is, what do we need for that to happen? That is, what do we need to do to promote that end or purpose, to ensure that it is actually reached? And he has a simple answer in section 4, peace. As he says in the beginning, he says, and since the part is a sample of the whole, and since individual men find that they grow in prudence and wisdom when they can sit quietly, it is evident that mankind, too, is most free and easy to carry on its work, which is intellectual development, when it enjoys the quiet and tranquility of peace. And then he goes on this praise of peace and its centrality in Christianity. But you can see the logic of his thinking here. He has set out what he believes to be the goal of human civilization as a whole, human civilization per se. And then he's asked himself, what is it that needs to be there in order to reach that goal? It's peace. As opposed to conflict, as opposed to uncertainty, as opposed to war, as opposed to... It's peace. That is, human development is only going to happen if we have peace. And that's a very interesting thing to say, I would say. Very thought-provoking thing to say. The means toward the end, and the end being intellectual progress for human beings in understanding everything. You're not going to get that unless you have peace. And so, that's a really interesting answer. And for him, it's the most important thing, peace. Look what he says here at the end of this section. What I have now said makes clear what is that best way by following which mankind may achieve its proper work. And consequently, it is also clear what we must directly take to attain that final goal set for all our work, which is universal peace. Let this then be our principle underlying all our subsequent arguments, as I said, and let it serve as a standard set before us by which to test the truth of whatever we shall try to prove. That is, the overall concern, Dante's overall concern politically, is peace. And so we can anticipate that whatever else may be the case, everything must be directed towards peace because, according to his argument at least, the only way that human beings can reach their potential, can actualize their potential, and human civilization can accomplish its goal is if it has peace.